morning, everyone. And as Gail and I have been talking about this topic of faithfulness and considering the women in our lives who've been influential in different ways, that virtue of faithfulness just seemed to keep coming up over and over again. Faithfulness is really not something that we do naturally. It's not something that comes naturally to us. It's actually something that we can't even be instructed in per se. So you don't take a course in faithfulness and then expect to be faithful. It's also something that really, I think, is helpful to have a desire for. And when we do have a desire to be faithful, I think there's some motivation, but desire alone is not enough either to become a faithful person. Faithfulness really begins with awareness that we have a need to be faithful. And then it's fueled by desire, and it requires, though, then action to actually become faithful. Stephen Garber, in his book, The Fabric of Faithfulness, observes that men and women who have been faithful to God throughout their lives learn to take into their hearts the disappointments and sorrows that come to them, finding a deeper, truer faith as they do so. He continues, indeed, they have been woven together, or they've woven together belief and behavior into a fabric of faithfulness that has kept their hearts alive in the face of evil and injustice, grief, and pain. So you might say that the fabric of faithfulness is really formed on the loom of life, where the warp of the loom is belief and the woof of the loom is behavior. Making a decision and acting then on that decision. Today, we're going to look at three familiar women from the Bible and consider how in their lives God developed the virtue of faithfulness. Hannah, Ruth, and Esther.
We also want to introduce you to three women who are living today and tell you their stories. Many of you know that Larry and I were on staff with Crew before we came back to the gathering place. For 18 years, we traveled, 5 years as volunteers and 13 years as full-time missionaries with Crew. We traveled around the world, and our training team was usually men. And when we traveled, it was men, and it was me. And I started to pray that as we arrived in country, that the Lord would have a woman there waiting for me that I could connect with and I could communicate with and I could fellowship with. And God answered this prayer. We met some amazing women in many countries of the world, women who had stories similar to the ones that Larry's going to look at in Scripture today, women who also made a specific, definite decision that they were going to be faithful women. They didn't allow disappointments, sadness, sorrows, griefs. They didn't allow anything to keep them from being a faithful woman, but rather they deepened their walk with the Lord because of the experiences in their lives. So I look forward to introducing you to three of those women today.
So let's look at Hannah from the book of 1 Samuel, which is where we find her story, chapters 1 and 2. The time period is the period of the judges, just before Saul becomes king and after the children of Israel have entered the promised land. Hannah is married to a man named Elkanah. He's a devout man who fears the Lord. Elkanah also has another wife, Peninnah. Peninnah has several children, both boys and girls, and Hannah is unable to conceive. Annually, Elkanah celebrates Passover and worships the Lord at Shiloh, which is about a 15-mile journey from where they lived in the area of Bethlehem. Annually, Peninnah, on those trips, taunts Hannah. She ridicules her because she has no children. she reduces her to tears and misery. But on one occasion, God intervenes in this particular situation, and that's where we find these words in 1 Samuel 1 and beginning with verse 9. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made with him. And then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So let's look a little bit further then at this story. The next day, they leave Shiloh, return to home, and that year, Hannah conceives a child. She gives birth to a baby boy, and she names him Samuel, which means heard of God. In the next 3 years, as Passover comes, Hannah doesn't go with the rest of the family, but remains home during that Passover time until Samuel is weaned. And we pick up then in verse 24 of chapter 1. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. So Hannah made a vow, and more importantly, Hannah kept her vow. She left the child at the temple. No record of her coming back to him is made. And yet Hannah has 5 more children in her lifetime. She experiences Hebrews 11:6. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Hannah takes into her heart the disappointment, the sorrow, the injustice of that situation, the anger, the loneliness, the grief, the pain, and in Garber's words, develops a deeper, truer faith. She acts on her decision to be faithful. She keeps her vow to the Lord, and she weaves the fabric of faithfulness into her life.
In 1993, Larry and I were part of the first group of Americans invited into the city of Samara, Russia. We were there to instruct teachers how to use a curriculum on Christian morals and ethics in their classroom. Now, from 1935 to 1951, Samara went under the name of Kubyshev, and it was a closed city, closed even to other Russian citizens. During World War II, it served as an alternative capital for the Soviet Union in case the German army was to come in and conquer in Moscow. The Communist Party and government organizations were there, and they built a dugout that was called Stalin's Bunker for Joseph Stalin's protection. And all that time, Samara was an industrial city. They supplied aircraft, firearms, ammunition to the Russian army. So during that time, the people of Russia, and especially the children in school, were taught there is no God. They heard that over and over again. There is no God. I had the assignment one day of teaching on prayer to 200 Russian elementary school teachers. Now, I taught children at that time. I didn't really do adults, and they were a little bit scary to me, especially in another culture. But nonetheless, that was my assignment, and I agonized over it. How do you teach prayer to somebody that doesn't even believe in God? I remember the day vividly. The setting was in a big old stone building in a large room that was very cold on a late October day. The teacher sat with winter coats and scarves and boots and mittens all around the room. As I started to speak, the Holy Spirit put words in my mouth from a very personal experience. The room was silent. There wasn't a sound. No one moved. No one left. No one was angry or complained because I was talking about prayer. When I finished the session, an elderly lady came up to me. She just looked ancient to me. She had a couple teeth missing. Her skin was very wrinkled. You could tell she'd had a rough life. She was dressed all in black with a black scarf draped over her head. She took my hands and she started to kiss me. She kissed my hand, went up my arm, across my forehead, down the other arm, and she held my hands tightly. And she said the words that my translator told me. She said, for 40 years, I prayed that God would send someone to our city to tell our children about God. Now you've come. I can go home and die. Her name was Anastasia, and her faith had a profound effect on me. I think actually on both of us. I realized that day that God had his people everywhere. In all the countries around the world, there were probably little older ladies like Anastasia that had prayed for years. And this woman loved him. At some point in time, she made a commitment to pray for the children of her city, and she didn't waver in that for 40 years. And she believed that God was going to answer it. She truly believed God was going to answer her prayer. Anastasia, like Hannah, was faithful to pray over time. She believed God would answer, and she waited for that answer to come. As Garber states in what Larry read earlier, both Hannah and Anastasia, they wove together the belief that they had and the behavior. They put them together into a fabric of faithfulness that kept their hearts alive. And as I thought of Anastasia, it kept her heart alive in the face of evil, the face of injustice, in the face of grief, and in the face of pain.
The second woman we want to look at is Ruth. The story of Ruth comes from the book of Ruth, and this particular incident we're talking about here is in the first chapter. The time period, again, is the period of the judges, but the country is Moab. A famine forces Elimelech and his wife, Naomi, along with their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to move to Moab. Life is hard there. First, Elimelech dies, and Naomi becomes a widow. Her sons marry, but they marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Orpah and Ruth are worshipers of Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. Not long after, Mahlon and Chilion die, leaving Naomi with no one to care for her and no one to care for her daughters-in-law. Ruth chapter 1, verse 6 says this, "Then she, Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you've dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband.' And then she kissed them. And they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." Naomi, Moab, meant a lot of grief and a lot of pain, disappointment, fear, for the fact that there were no husbands there for not only her, but also for her daughters-in-law, is also a great disappointment. There are no prospects even for husbands if Ruth and Orpah come with her. And there are no family ties in Judah. So in verse 15, Ruth talks with them. And verse 14 says that they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Orpah returns to her family. We know no more of her. But Ruth makes a decision, a critical decision. She takes into her heart the sorrow, the grief, the pain, the destitution of her situation in Moab. Plus, she takes into her heart the uncertainty and the fear of what lies ahead by going with Ruth. She acts on the decision to be faithful, knowing that those things are in her heart, and she makes her vow to a new God and goes with Naomi no matter what, based on that decision.
In Jamaica, we met a lady named Betty Lawrence that reminds me of Ruth. She was married. She was a working mom. She was a successful insurance agent. In fact, she had her own business. She was a believer. She loved young people, and she worked with them in her church. She also had a big concern for the young people of Jamaica that just lived on the streets, that were part of gangs. And actually, it was not uncommon that many of these gang members would die before the age of 20. She saw advertisements for a Crossroads conference that was coming, and she was drawn to it. Now, the conference was meant for teachers, healthcare workers, social workers. Betty was none of those things. But she went to the people that were organizing it and asked if she could come, and they gave her permission to attend. So she came to the conference, all 4 days of the conference, and she took page after page after page of notes during the conference. And each day, all through the day, she just felt like God was tugging at her and increasing that concern for the young people of Jamaica. At the end of the conference, she took this pile of notes that she had, and she devised a plan to help her reach the unemployed and the unemployable teens of Jamaica. We heard those words over and over from Betty, the unemployed and the unemployable. Now, Betty had no money. She had no building. She had no curriculum. She didn't really have any experience. And she also had a full-time job in a business that she needed to run. She had to make a choice. Would she continue to live life as she had known it, or would she follow what she felt God was calling her to do? Well, she began to make contacts. She talked to the government officials first, who gave her nothing, no encouragement, no hope, and definitely no help. So she began to contact business owners, and little by little, she raised enough money that she felt she could start with a few students. So she interviewed each prospective student, and she required a 3-month commitment from them. Now, they had to say they would be there every day for 3 months. She began with a few students and started teaching them how to be successful in the tourism and hospitality industry, which is the main employer in Jamaica. She soon realized it was impossible to continue running the insurance agency, continue having appointments, and all the follow-up that took. And she was at the point of decision. Now, her belief was that God wanted her to do something to help the youth of Jamaica. So her behavior had to match that. She walked away from the insurance agency with no promise of any steady income of any kind. When we were in Jamaica, we visited her school. Now, the students met us, and they were smiling and happy and enthusiastic, and you could tell they had a lot of pride in what they were doing. Betty had a room where she taught students how to make a bed. She had a room where she taught them how to set a table properly and how to serve in the right way to a customer. She had a room where students studied the Bible and character education. She required students to look clean and neat all the time. She asked the boys to wear black pants and the girls black skirts. They had a white blouse or a shirt. That was their uniform. They always had to be crisp and clean. She taught them to look at each other eye to eye. They worked on interview questions together and practiced. And she arranged job interviews for students and taught them how to dress appropriately just by adding a tie to that white shirt or maybe a scarf for the girls. At the end of 3 months, those first students graduated, and over 90% of them began working right away. At the end of a year, 85% of them were still employed in the jobs that they had started the year before. The YES program was launched. The YES program stands for Youth Enhancement Services. Betty continued to challenge business owners and churches to help her finance the school. After a few years, the government finally took notice that something was happening here, and they realized what she was doing was being successful with students. So the government started to give her funding. But no matter where her funding came from, Betty never backed down from teaching God's word to her students every single day because she knew that was the beginning of her calling from the Lord. She stayed true no matter what. The program's still going today. It's over 20 years old now. And each year, Jamaica celebrates an annual Women in Business Day. In 2018, the Jamaica Observer, a newspaper there, did an article, and they titled it Big Up Boss Ladies in honor of the Women in Business Day. They cited 5 successful businesswomen from all over the country of Jamaica, and Betty was one of them. And the article said this: Big up boss lady Betty Lawrence, whose consistent priority of service to God and community impact inspires her work. I was just really taken that the newspaper article recognized her priority as being a service to God. Thanks for opening the YES Youth Centers and the opportunity they provide for our youth. Betty, like Ruth, has been faithful to follow. She made the decision to leave what she knew, what was comfortable and secure, and follow the direction she believed God wanted her to go. She had no promise of anyone to join her. She had no promise of income. She didn't even have a promise of success. She was just doing what she felt God wanted her to do. But Betty's belief, as we saw with Ruth, resulted in continuous faithful behavior over time.
Well, let's look at the third Bible character here, the woman from the book of Esther. The time frame for what's happening here in Esther's life is about 25 years after the first exiles returned to Judah and Jerusalem from Babylon. Most of the Jews, however, who were living in Babylon were comfortable there, and they chose to stay rather than to return. Among them was a young woman, Esther, plus her older cousin, Mordecai, who raised Esther as his own daughter after the death of Esther's parents. The king of the country at that time, or the kingdom, is Xerxes. The Hebrew Ahasuerus is what we'll hear as we read the scriptures, is sitting on the throne. And the kingdom is large, 127 provinces that stretch from Ethiopia all the way to India. Ahasuerus is known for his great feasts. And one day he commands his queen, Queen Vashti, to be on display for her guests. But Vashti refuses. And because she refuses, the decision is made by the king to depose her. And the search then begins for a new queen. Esther 2, beginning with verse 8 and some verses following, says, "So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, Esther also was taken into the king's palace. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." The story of Esther is perhaps one of the greatest underdog stories of all time. Here is a young woman who was at one time a slave girl, no doubt, and becomes a queen. Mordecai is proud, I'm sure, and he visits the palace daily. But elsewhere in the palace, there is intrigue that's taking place. King Ahasuerus places wealthy Haman over all his officials. And the king also makes an edict that everyone who comes into Haman's presence is to bow low. Mordecai refuses on the basis that he's a Jew. And Haman is enraged that here is this Jew man who will not bow to him even at the king's edict. So Haman conceives of a plot, and that is to exterminate not just Mordecai, but all of the Jews in the entire kingdom. The edict goes out to all of the provinces that people are to prepare for almost a year from that time when the extermination will take place. Mordecai hears of the plot, and he pleads with Esther to appeal to the king. Esther fears for her life, tells Mordecai that she could possibly be executed if she is to do that. Yet she does see herself as being the only hope, not only for herself, but also for her people. And she sends words to Mordecai that have become rather famous. If you read the scriptures, you probably will have heard them or read them before. "Then I will go to the king," she says, "though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Well, Esther prepares herself, and for 3 days she fasts, her handmaids fasts, and she has Mordecai prepare the Jews who are in the kingdom, as many of them as possible, to fast along with her. And fearing for her life, she courageously comes before the king, who extends his scepter and receives her. He also grants her a wish to attend a feast along with Haman. Now, in Esther chapter 7, we read these words: "So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, 'What is your wish, Queen Esther?' It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is this man, and where is he? Who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Haman was executed on the next day. The king orders the extermination plan to be stopped immediately. And these things are what Esther seems to take into her heart. She believes. She believes that somehow God is going to take care of her people. Mordecai's challenge, I'm sure, are ringing in her ears. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. She takes into her heart the risk of losing everything, the fear of humiliation and public disgrace, the potential of execution, and perhaps the glory as a young woman of being a queen. She acts on her decision to be faithful, no matter the cost.
The last person we want to introduce you to today is Lisette. Lisette lives in Honduras. She's a single woman, and she attended the very first Crossroads conference that we ever did. Her father was the national director of Crew in Honduras, and she was on staff there. She grew up in a Christian home. Her entire family was in ministry. Even her brother-in-law was a pastor. And in many ways, she had kind of a sheltered life. She was certainly not the sort of person that one would picture leading a movement against drug lords and government corruption. But that's exactly where Lisette ended up. She was concerned about the number of students dropping out every year out of school, the number of kids selling drugs, the number of kids addicted to drugs. And she was especially concerned that drug lords were taking over the city where she lived, and not just her city, but other cities in Honduras as well. As a result of the drug lords, there was more and more corruption happening all the time in the government. In fact, the last time that Larry and I were in Honduras, the violence had gotten so bad it was happening nightly on the streets. And one night we heard gunshots go off, and we both jumped up and jumped out of bed and ended up laying flat on the floor because it sounded like those gunshots were right under our bedroom window. By this time, Lisette had successfully been able to get the Crossroads curriculum into many schools in Honduras. One of those schools was a major high school in Tegucigalpa, which is the capital of Honduras. That particular school has 5,000 students. They had so many students that they actually went to school in shifts. The first shift had 60 teachers, and they went from 7 in the morning till noon. The second shift had a new group of 60 teachers that would come in. They went from noon to 6. And then there was a third group with a new group of 60 teachers that came in, and they had classes from 6 to 10 at night. So a huge school. Politicians started to notice this woman was making inroads into these schools. And initially, they felt really good about that. She was being successful. She was putting a character education curriculum in schools, and the curriculum was actually based on the life of Jesus. One politician especially wanted to support Lisette. He was running on an anti-establishment platform and what she was doing just fit right into his goals. So he initially got on board with her, but over time, he started receiving death threats from the drug lords. And eventually, Lizette herself was receiving death threats and threats to her whole family, her nieces, nephews, sister, brother-in-law. But neither she nor this politician gave up. They kept on. They kept on going. He was not elected. He lost. So it became harder and harder for Lizette. The drug lords were against the character education curriculum being in schools because if students were starting to care about themselves and be more concerned about the way they were living, then they weren't as interested in getting into drugs, and they weren't interested in selling drugs for them. While the government initially supported Lizette, they turned against her when the drug lords started putting so much pressure on them. And she wrestled with the question, should I give up? And I remember when we were there and talking with Lizette, it was so hard what she was facing, and she felt like she was facing it alone. She said, I'm putting my life in danger. I'm putting the life of my entire family in danger. But then on the other hand, if she were to quit, who was going to be helping the kids? It was a defining moment for Lizette. She didn't quit. She had the support from her family, and she stayed the course, and she continued to fight for character education based on Jesus Christ as a role model of character. As a result of her efforts, the Crossroads curriculum had the full endorsement of the Minister of Education and the freedom to implement the strategy throughout Honduras. Lizette was able to influence major companies like Johnson & Johnson to help support her efforts financially. And she was invited to serve for 3 years as a consultant on youth behavior in the office of the First Lady of Honduras. Lizette is a perfect example of what Larry read at the beginning from Garber. She took into her heart the disappointment and sorrow, grief, pain, fear, and remained faithful in spite of it. Esther and Lizette are both examples of women who could have comfortably just settled back and left everything kind of status quo. But instead, they were faithful to do what was right, what they believed God was asking them to do, rather than just taking care of themselves and watching out for their own safety. They both knew God could deliver them. They both believed that. They also both knew whether he did or not, they were still going to do what was right, what God had given them to do. So we've looked at 3 women from the Bible today. We've looked at 3 women from the 20th, 21st centuries. And each one of them faced challenging circumstances. Each could have easily given up what they believed in to be a calling, what they believed to be a calling from God. And society would have understood. Society probably said to them, your life is more important than anything you can do there. And what you're doing is just too dangerous. You ought to quit. You really should stop. But each of these 6 women determined to be faithful to God. And in so doing, God entrusted them each with a specific job to do for him. Today is Mother's Day, and I want to say Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. But I've been blessed to have a mom that's been a great example. My mom's now 101. She's modeled continuous faithfulness for me my whole life. People watching her would say she has every reason to be angry at God and maybe even be bitter. You see, her home was destroyed in a flood. Everything that Mom and Dad had worked for was taken away. 1 year after that, my dad died very suddenly as a result of a stroke, and Mom became a widow at age 54. 1 year after that, her son, daughter-in-law, and her 2 grandchildren were killed in a car accident. She had a lot of reasons to be bitter, but she never has been. She's remained faithful to God, and her faith has deepened, and she's enjoyed her life in spite of the tough times. So I want to leave you today with a challenge and encourage you to determine that you will be a woman of faith or a man of faith. Don't give up, no matter how tough life gets. Don't give up. Stay true to your calling, whatever that is, whether it's a mother at home, a person running a business, Maybe you're a person that God has called to be a person of prayer. Whatever God's asking you to do, stay true to him. Remain faithful. And remember Garber's description of men and women who sustain visions of faith over a lifetime, not just for a period of time, but over a lifetime. He describes them as this: they learn to take into their hearts the disappointments and sorrows that come to them, finding a deeper, truer faith as they do so. Rather than being shipwrecked by the brokenness of the world, they learn to navigate their way through, holding on to the integrity of their vocations through life. Indeed, they have woven together belief and behavior. What they believe, they act on and show it in their behavior, into a fabric of faithfulness that has kept their hearts alive in the face of evil and injustice, grief and pain. May you be that woman. May you be that man that Garber describes.
We've talked today about faithfulness as a virtue, but faithfulness is also a fruit of the Spirit. In Galatians 5:22 and 23, faithfulness is identified as a fruit of the Spirit that is what Jesus left us when he returned to his Father. It may sound like it's difficult, maybe even impossible, to do the kinds of things that we've heard about today. And indeed, I'm sure each of the people, if we had the opportunity to speak with them personally, would say, no doubt it has. But that's why God gave us the Helper, the Holy Spirit. And the fruit of that Spirit, one of the fruits of that, the Spirit's presence, is faithfulness.